sure we were in focus. Okay, I think we can start. We on? All right, let me open and we'll get cranked off here. Father, we're thankful for another day, and we're thankful for your goodness to us. We're thankful for the day you've given us. We ask that you give us your guidance and your discernment and your resources to deal with the things you've set before us. We're thankful for the time together to look at another portion of your word. We're thankful that you've given us physically time to be here, and we would remember those who are not with us, of our families. Some are ill, some are traveling. We'd ask your attention to them. Again, we thank you for this time. Guide our thinking now and guide our discussion as we do open another portion of your scriptures. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, point of personal privilege. I believe, if memory serves, that it was Yogi Berra who said, "This seems a lot like deja vu all over again." So this seems like all over again. I was standing in this same spot with this same situation about 5 months ago. So it's good to be back. Judy and I are extremely blessed and extremely grateful for your support, your attention, your prayers, your thoughts, particularly for the groceries. So we're very fortunate to be in a church family that is so caring. So this material, and we're going to, let me just do a disclaimer. We're not going to do a lot of actual work in 2 Corinthians. What I'm going to do today is just lay out some background material so that we can begin to understand more clearly why Paul says what he says in this text. I wrote this, a month ago. We were supposed to go through this on January 5th. So I'm going to pick up where I would have been on January 5th, if that's okay. I don't know what y'all covered in the last 2 weeks. Maybe there'll be some repetition. I don't know. In the last week and a half, 2 weeks, I had very little to do other than sit and watch the California fires on television. And as I did that, I began to think, maybe there's some comparisons we can make between those folks in California and Paul as he thought about writing this piece of text. So now, I know we can't push that comparison too far, but let's think a minute about these folks in California. They're losing a lot of material stuff. Their houses are gone, their businesses are gone. But they're also losing memorabilia, which is tied to their memories. There was an interview yesterday, and I don't know whether y'all saw this or not, but there was an interview yesterday, a lady who had a restaurant in Malibu or Palisades, I don't remember which, that she had, they bought a house in 1973, and she put a restaurant in it. So she lost the building, but she also lost all of that effort that she had put into that building to establish and grow this restaurant. And she was just kind of parenthetically, she was saying that she doesn't know whether insurance will cover enough so she can rebuild. And then perhaps even more distressing, she does not know whether they're going to let her rebuild a restaurant in that spot because of zoning restrictions. So, like I said, we can't push that comparison too far, but we might begin to think about the difficulty Paul was in as he was thinking about and writing this particular piece of text. So then the question would become, why is that? How were these two things related? And partially it's because this is the most personal and emotional of the letters that Paul wrote. This is not typical Paulinian corpus. In some ways it is, and again, some ways it's not. So we'll see in this letter, and this letter reflects Paul's concerns for the Corinthians and his concern for his previous work in Corinth. So with that kind of background, here we go. So we're going to begin today to study the text that we know as 2 Corinthians. Okay, hang on to that thought. The text we know as 2 Corinthians. Now, after our interlude where Paul David was teaching us spiritual disciplines, and we thank you for that, we're going to return to the Paulinian letters. I'll come back to this in a minute, but you remember we spent many months in the text we know as 1 Corinthians. So we're returning to his writings. So let's think a little bit about history. Let's think a little bit about, in order to put us into context, let's think a little bit about what we know about Corinth. And we start, well, let me just add this, then I'll go on. There's a couple of places where we get a lot of historical information, and Acts is one of them. We've spent some time early on in Acts. And then obviously we get some from 1 Corinthians. Interestingly, not so much in 2 Corinthians. There are a number of references to other things, but very little specific historical information in 2 Corinthians. So we start in Acts chapter 18. And we learn that in chapter 18, verse 1, we learn that Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, if you've got a map in your mind, if you can think about a map, you find Greece. Greece looks like a boot. That's not Louisiana, that's Greece. Right down at the bottom on the left-hand side is Athens, which was the capital. And then right straight across to the west is Corinth. So that gives us a geographical marker, and we know that Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, Corinth is about 36 miles or 47 kilometers west of Athens. Verse 1 says, after this, what is this? Think Acts 18. What had Paul been doing? Huh? Yeah, he traveled a lot. He got a lot of frequent flyer miles. But remember what he was doing in Athens? What did he do in Athens? Preaching. Yeah, he's preaching to all these Greek philosophers. So we have all that narrative, and like I said, we've been through that. So he leaves there. He goes he goes west to Corinth. And we know that we know some stuff about Corinth. Corinth was a Roman colony. It was a rather wealthy city. It had two seaports. It's on an isthmus, And there's a seaport on each side. If you got a seaport, what else do you have? Huh? Sailors. I'm sorry, what? Mardi Gras. Well, that too. Actually, no, I think that came from Mobile, but that's a whole nother story. If you got sailors, you got what? Any Navy people in here? If you are, I'll hush. Huh? Yeah, parties. And with parties come, I'm stretching here now. Huh? Ladies of the evening. So, anyway, so the sense is Corinth was a pretty rowdy, if I can use that word, place. We also know that there were a number of pagan temples in Corinth, and a lot of that relates to 1 Corinth. So it was politically and economically important. It was not necessarily a real spiritual, and put that in quotes, city. So we know that Paul was there for about 18 months, and then he leaves the church. Now, part of what we're going to begin to see is what happened to that church after Paul left. We also know that in the church in Corinth, there were a number of different groups. We know that there obviously were Romans, because it was a Roman colony. We know that there were Greeks. We know that there were Jews. We know there were slaves. We know that there were freedmen. So you've got an amalgam of different cultures that are in that one brand new church. So he, like I said, he goes to Corinth for about 18 months. He leaves. We'll come back to this, but he's on his way to Jerusalem, but he stops briefly in Ephesus. Okay. Now, one of the things that folks like to do is we like to establish how many letters did Paul actually write to Corinth? How many trips did he actually make to Corinth? Well, depending on who you read, this is not an easy fact to establish. It's generally thought that he wrote 4 letters and made 3 visits, and we're going to revisit that a little bit. Okay. I'm not sure what that tone means. Maybe we're done. Okay. What I want to do is I want to establish a timeline. I love timelines. So you can either draw this on a piece of paper or you just kind of do it in your mind, in your head, whichever doesn't matter. But to help us not only begin to understand some of the stuff about why he wrote this, but the time and the situations that he was involved in. So think about your timeline. We're going to do 6 or 7 points. So our first point, this is the first time Paul came to Corinth. It is believed that it was in the spring of 51 AD. And he goes there, he ministers for about 1.5 years. Then in the fall of 52 AD, he leaves. He sails with Priscilla and Aquila to Ephesus. Now, also, if you think about a map and you think about Corinth being over here, almost directly across on a body of water from Corinth is Ephesus. So when Paul leaves, it says he leaves Corinth. Probably he went to one of these seaports on the east side and actually sailed across to to Ephesus. So in the fall of 52 A.D., with Priscilla and Aquila, he sails over to Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila stayed in Ephesus, and then Paul moves on, going eventually to Jerusalem. So in Ephesus, Priscilla and Aquila met Apollos, and you remember that they mentored Apollos, they instructed, they taught, and they sent Apollos to Corinth to do a period of ministry. And we find that in Acts chapter 18, verses 18 through 28. So that's our starting point. That's our first point on this timeline. This is the first time Paul was actually in Corinth, and he was there to establish that church. So, okay, point 2 on our timeline. While Apollos was ministering in Corinth, this is Acts chapter 19, in the fall of 53 A.D., Paul returns to Ephesus. If you think geographically, he's up here, he goes across a land bridge into Syria, goes to Antioch, and then he goes down to Jerusalem. That's his second missionary journeys. And then in fall of 53, he apparently retraces somewhat his track and comes back to Ephesus. This is during his third missionary journey. And he remained in Ephesus for approximately 2.5 years. He's establishing Ephesus as a center for evangelizing that entire area. That's Acts chapter 19. Now let's think 1 Corinthians. We got to shift gears here. Let's think 1 Corinthians. And if you remember, in chapter 5, verse 9, there's a letter mentioned. And they don't tell us anything about it. They just mention a letter. This was probably a letter that was misunderstood by the Corinthians. We get that from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 11. So this was probably his first letter. Now, we don't have this letter. This letter was lost to us. We don't know why he wrote it. We don't know what it said. But it was probably misunderstood by the Corinthians and the Corinthian church. Again, 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 11. So it was probably written sometime during his Ephesian ministry. So he's in Ephesus for 2.5 years, and this first letter was probably written sometime during that time. Okay, point 3. Somehow, and again, we don't have documentation for this scripturally. There may be some extra biblical documentation, but scripturally we don't know. But apparently Paul learned about the misunderstanding that was in Corinth, as well as additional problems that were going on in the church. And he learned this. You remember, we talked about this at some length. Remember how did he learn what was going on in Corinth, the Corinthian church? This is from 1 Corinthians. Yeah, somebody come and told him. He didn't get an email, they came and told him. So, first of all, from the household of Chloe. And then, let's see, where is that? That's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11. And then later on, there was a delegation that came. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 17. And they brought word, they brought collaboration, they brought validation, if you please, about the difficulties in Corinth. And they raised some specific questions for Paul to answer. This is the second letter that Paul wrote. And this is the one that we know as 1 Corinthians. And it was written to address these difficulties and these matters that are going on in the church. So it was from Ephesus that he wrote his second letter. And his purpose was to correct some of the divisions that had arisen in the church at Corinth, as well as some of the irregularities, scandals, immoralities that were creeping into the church from the city itself. And we do have that letter. That one has been preserved. And without reteaching the entire book of 1 Corinthians, you remember that some of the general overriding themes was calling these Christians back to an understanding of what fellowship with Christ actually means. It was declaring the spiritual values that make Christian faith a living and vital thing. And you may remember, this is interesting, you may remember that we spent a long time in the text that we know as 1 Corinthians. We actually started that study March the 20th, 2022. Boy, I was about to put another century on that puppy. No, 2022. I don't know. I don't remember when we finished it, but it was about 2.5 years. So we spent a good deal of time there. So that's our third point, where he writes his second letter to the church at Corinth. Okay, fourth point. Apparently, the problems in Corinth had still not been resolved. Now, we don't know specifically how he found out, but it's possible that he found out from Timothy. Again, this is a reference in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Chapter 4, 17, then chapter 16, verse 10. That possibly he found this out from Timothy. So Paul decides he's going to spend a second visit to Corinth, which he does. So he sails from Ephesus on the east across this body of water to Corinth on the west. Now, this seems to be what was referred to as the painful visit, which we note in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. So as we read 2 Corinthians, we begin to get some hints, if you please, some inferences about some of the difficulties that he's had, and this is one of them. Also, in reference to 2 Corinthians 2:1, this seems to be associated with the man or men that's mentioned in chapter 2, verse 5, chapter 7, verse 12, related to the failure of the Corinthians that supported Paul. Now, I'm going to push pause. There was a group of Jews, I started to say scholars, I'm not sure that's true, but there was a group of Jews that followed Paul around pretty much everywhere he went. And they followed him to make trouble in the churches that he had established. So it's possible that this man referred to in chapter 2 and chapter 7 was a part of that group. So we know that Paul had visited Corinth for a very short time, was apparently rebuffed by the church leaders, so that the very church he had established wouldn't let him teach. They would not let him come in and preach or teach in that church. And I've got peanut butter on my pages. They're stuck together. All right, bear with me. Oh, this is ridiculous. I may have to call Judy up here and turn my pages. And if I skip forward, we're going to go past 2 or 3 points on our timeline. And we definitely don't want to do that. Okay, here we go. So they wouldn't let him teach in the church that he had established sometime in the past. And the thinking is it had become permeated with a lot of false Christianity. So as we, so to speak, read between the lines in 2 Corinthians, again, we can begin to see, to understand some of what's going on with Paul that prompted him to write this second text. Okay, point 5. After this short visit in Corinth where they really didn't treat him very well, he goes back to Ephesus. So he probably gets on a boat, sails east back to Ephesus. And from there, he writes a very short, sharp, caustic letter rebuffing and reproving the Corinthians for their attitude. Now, we don't have this letter. This one has been lost to us. It's clear that Paul wrote a letter, but it hasn't been preserved. Maybe, and this is kind of speculation, kind of reading between the lines again, maybe it's because when he wrote it, he was in a state of extreme, I would say anger, but distress, despondency. Think about this. He spent 18 months, year and a half establishing this church. He left it in pretty good shape. And now he gets notice that, hey, these guys are really screwing up. So I go to help them and they won't let me teach. Now think about that. If we were doing church planning, which we may do at some point, you establish your church, you leave, you want to come back and do Sunday school, and they won't let you. So just think about how that would set. So he writes this letter probably at a point of distress, of anger, despondency, whatever. But it hasn't. We don't have that now. There's a couple of reasons that may be for that. It may be because he wrote it in this state, and what he said went beyond what the Spirit intended. So it would not have been fully and wholly inspired as his other writings. Another possibility is that it dealt exclusively with the local situation in Corinth, so it didn't have the universal application that some of his other writings do. But we do know that after he wrote it, he was grieved. He was deeply distressed about writing this letter. Now we see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, because it has a very stark disciplinary nature to it, which we see in chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. So he writes this letter from Ephesus. He leaves Ephesus in the spring of 56 AD, and he's going to Macedonia. We see that in Acts 20, verse 1. Again, if you got a map in your head, Ephesus is over here. We'll talk about Troas in a minute. Troas is just a little bit north of Ephesus. You go up, you go over to the west, and there's a big landmass over here that's Macedonia. So that's where Paul is headed. So after he writes this letter, he takes off, he goes to, headed toward Macedonia. Before he leaves Ephesus, he sends Titus. My oldest granddaughter's husband's name is Titus. So he sends Titus by sea back to Corinth. Titus gets on a boat in Ephesus and sails west to Corinth, holding this letter. So he takes it with him over there. While Paul then takes a longer land route through Troas, which is a city north of Ephesus, headed toward Macedonia. Now, apparently, he spent some time in Troas, establishing a ministry there. There was opportunity for ministry there. And at the same time, he was still having a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress about this letter he sent, where he wasn't apparently very nice. And he does not know at that point how the Corinthians are going to respond. So after some time in Troas, I forgot how long, it was some time. Anyway, he leaves there, headed to Macedonia to meet Titus, to find out how they responded to this letter. Well, when he gets to Macedonia, Titus is not there. But Titus eventually shows up. He arrived in Macedonia, probably in Philippi. Now, there are two cities mentioned in Macedonia. One is Philippi, the other one is Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki in Greek. So Titus arrives probably at Philippi, but maybe at Thessalonica. And the information he gives Paul, he gives him two pieces of information. One is that there is actually correction and repentance in Corinth, so they're doing better. So he would relieve some of his anxiety. But there's always a but. Titus also tells him about a group of men, a group of people that are opposing him. And they're saying some pretty nasty things about him. Now, this may have been the same group that was originally there when he established the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians. It may be this group that's following him around wherever he goes to cause trouble. We don't know exactly who they are, but we do know that there were a group of folks that Titus tells him is opposing him. Now, at some point, and again, we don't have documentation for this, we don't know when this was, but at some point he had intended to make another trip to Corinth and changed his mind. So this group of guys pick on this. They pick this up, so to speak, and they begin to talk about him. They hinted at his cowardness for not coming on this trip. They accused him of vacillating, of insincerity, for changing his mind. Does that sound politically familiar? I am absolutely not going to get political, but if you listen to the news and to some of these folks, they'll pick on anything they can find. And that's what this group is doing to Paul. They accused him of having meanness in his demeanor. They accused him of simplicity in his speech. They picked on him because he had no, what they called letters of commendation from Jerusalem. And there's a stretch. and they picked on him for his so-called dubious position regarding the law. So they're trying to find anything they can to pick on him. They even insinuated doubts about his honesty. They charged him with guile and fraudulent self-interest regarding the collection he was making for Jerusalem. And they even hinted that they doubted his sanity. So a lot of stuff that Titus is telling Paul that they're doing. So how do you think he might have responded to that? Probably not very positively. So these charges would have been hard to take at any point, but they were especially hard because Paul was already suffering, so to speak, about how the Corinthians had responded to this letter. So it's kind of a double whammy. That's a good clinical term, by the way, a double whammy. So all this stress, all this anxiety, all this stuff had put him in a period of both mental and physical exhaustion. If you've ever had to endure a stress of any kind over a long period of time, you know that you get physically tired, you get mentally exhausted, and it's really a very hard situation to deal with. So although it wasn't in Paul's nature to defend himself, at this point, these charges were so extreme that he decides that he has to defend himself. Personally, he was neither required nor cared for any self-defense, but he felt obligated to clear his character from these innuendos because if unchallenged, the innuendos, the charges, would hinder his work both in Corinth and in other churches. So although he really didn't want to do this, and to negate any semblance of egotism or boasting, he's forced by the nature of his opponents to adopt a tone of self-defense. Uncharacteristic for Paul. Now we get another hint of this. Again, we don't have exact, complete documentation, but we get a hint of this because the word boasting occurs in the text we know as 2 Corinthians no less than 29 times. Anything reported, anything repeated is important. So that gives us another clue about the state that Paul is in and why he did, why he wrote what he wrote. And then related to the letters of commendation, this was really kind of a false accusation because he didn't need letters of commendation. He didn't need letters of commendation either from his peers or from Jerusalem because God had given him his marching orders, so to speak. He'd given him his commendation directly. So there was no need for him to have other letters to state that. Okay, point 6. Remember, Paul's in Macedonia. He's waiting on Titus. Titus comes and gives him all this information. So from Macedonia, Paul writes a 4th letter, which we know as 2 Corinthians. So the text that we're going to begin to take apart, the text we're going to begin to study, is believed to be the fourth letter that Paul writes. And he wrote it for a couple of three reasons. He wrote it to express thanksgiving for the repentance and renewed obedience of the Corinthian church. We'll see that in chapter 7. And again, I can't turn my pages. It's terrible when you get old and lose feeling in your fingers. None of y'all are experiencing that, I'm sure. Oh, this is embarrassing, guys. Robert, you want to come turn my pages with me? Should I not have called on you? I need to turn that page right there. Okay, never mind. I got it. There it is. I think you're right. See, sometimes you lose your memory too. Okay, so in this letter, he wrote to be thankful to the improvement in church in Corinth. He also wrote to encourage them to complete the collection that he was making for the, quote, saints in Jerusalem. And then he shows concern and defends his ministry against these accusations. In point 7 on our timeline, 7 and final, he makes a third visit to Corinth in the winter of 56-57 AD. We get this from Acts 20, verses 2 and 3. So if we're gonna summarize this, that's a lot of words, a lot of stuff. So if we're gonna summarize it, we might do it this way. Point 1, first visit to Corinth. Point 2, first letter to Corinth that was lost. Point 3, second letter to Corinth, which we know as 1 Corinthians. Point 4, second visit to Corinth, which was apparently the painful visit referenced in 2 Corinthians 2. Point 5, third letter to Corinth, which is now lost. Point 6, fourth letter to Corinth, which we know as 2 Corinthians. And then point 7, a third visit to Corinth. Now, we've referenced losing these two letters, and it could be a number of reasons for it. But obviously, these letters contain stuff that was not intended by God to become part of the biblical canon. And that's probably the most important reason. So we're beginning to get some sense of Paul's state of mind and his emotional state as we've talked about this, but we also begin to get this directly from the text itself. If you've got 1 Corinthians open, if you've got 2 Corinthians open, look at chapter 1, verse 8. Again, we're kind of reading between the lines. We're beginning to get some sense of where he is mentally, physically. So verse 8, he says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the" what? "Afflictions we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength." Now, notice this phrase, that we despaired of life itself. Now, somebody tells me that, I'm fixing to see if I can get them hospitalized, because this sounds suicidal. But it gives us a sense of where Paul was, and he gives us that in this text that we're gonna look at. Then he tells them how anxious and concerned he was about them. Look at chapter 2, verse 4. For I wrote to you out of much what? Affliction and anguish of heart, with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. Now, there's a dual concept there, and whoever has that particular pericope probably will break that down. But again, we have the sense of the distress that he's in when he writes this, and at the same time, the expression of his feelings for the Corinthians. So as we think about this with this background, we begin to understand some of the passion, some of the feeling that Paul is having as he writes. With trouble, tears, and heartaches is reflected in this letter. And, this is an and, not a but. I'll come back to that at some other point. At the same time, we get some very broad, some very grand, if you please, themes from this letter. There are three kind of overarching or overriding things that he talks about. He talks about the ministry within the church. This is in the first 5 chapters. There's an explanation of what ministry within the church ought to be. Then he talks about, within that section, he talks about that it's not a ministry of the old covenant, but it is a ministry of the new covenant. And he spends time laying that out, talking about that. And also in this section, he sets forth the resources available to a Christian. Then the third major one is giving and service or ministrations by the church. This is chapters 8 and 9. It's a discourse on giving, which was occasioned by the collection he's taken for Jerusalem. He says in chapter 8, I believe, that giving is to be the proof of love. So we've got 3 broad sections, 3 general things that he's talking about in this letter. Now within that, there's some kind of subtopics. Oh, I skipped one. He also talks about the subject of authority in the latter portions of the text. This is chapter 10, 11, and 12. In those 3 chapters, we have a change of tone. So here he begins to speak to the rebellious minority in Corinth who were still opposing or resisting, refusing his authority. And so then he begins to talk about where true authority comes from. Then in addition to these 3 major or broad topics, we have some additional kind of subtopics. He talks about thankfulness for the church's positive responses. He talks about preparation for his 3rd visit, and then he refutes these so-called false teachers. Now, some of us, as we were taught in inductive study, we like to outline a book. Now, I don't know in your preparations if you started trying to outline this book. If you have, you know that it is extremely difficult. It's not typical Paulinian corpus. It's different. This is different from any of the other letters we've studied. And it's different because if we were diagnosing Paul, we would diagnose him at this point as bipolar. There are many, I say many, there are significant mood swings. He goes, he goes from being happy about the restoration of the church, and then he swings the other way because of what they're doing to him and because of the difficulties. So there's a lot of mood swings. There's a variety of subjects. As we work through these pericopes, we'll see that the subject changes. And there are extensive parentheses. Now, we know that as we're working on Paul's letters, sometimes it's like he pushes pause, he puts a parentheses, and then he goes off on another track. Here, they're extended or they're extensive. Chapter 2, verse 14 through chapter 7, verse 4. That's, 5 chapters, so to speak. There are 5 chapters within this one parenthesis. So if you're trying to outline, if you're trying to structure, I thought about this. I said, I think I'll just take some time and see if I can structure this. Didn't work out very well because of these extended parentheses. And it's also difficult to outline because there's stuff going on in Corinth, Macedonia, Ephesus, Troas, that we don't have detailed information about. So we've got gaps that we can only guess or assume some things. So as we begin to think applicationally, we have some really applicational points here. He closes this letter, or this epistle, by addressing the people in Corinth, and applicationally he would also be addressing us. And there's several points. Examine yourselves to see whether you're holding to your faith. Are you believing God? Are you counting on him to do what he says he'll do? Are you walking into situations that if God doesn't follow through on that, you may find yourself in some difficulty? And then again, examine ourselves, whether we're holding to our faith. And then finally, kind of the capstone is to test yourself. This is in chapter 13, verse 5. So, and then kind of the summary, applicational point. Do we realize with experiential knowledge that Christ is in us? And Paul wraps that up. He puts a bow on it, that this is the actual secret or foundation of Christian living. So that's a very brief overview. We'll begin to flesh that out as we do these pericopes. And these are some of the concepts, some of the things that we're going to begin to learn as we go through this, always remembering the applicational points. You remember what the steps for inductive study are? Oh, come on, guys. You've been taught this forever. Observation, interpretation, application. So all three are important. the third one perhaps the most. So, okay, I am not going to ask for questions because I probably cannot answer. But we will, I think, well, Casey, you're up next. No? Oh, Lamar. Okay. Well, somebody will start to unpack this verse by verse, word by word. So, with that, you are